At 0449 hours, the Persian Gulf flashed once, a thin white streak slicing low over the water, and the USS Abraham Lincoln's watch team realized they had just been measured from point-blank range. It was pre-dawn, the hour when the sky is neither night nor day, just a slate ceiling that makes everything look closer than it is. A warm haze hung over the sea like breath on glass. Wind from the northwest at 14 knots pressed a choppy 2 to 3 foot sea into the carrier's bow. Humidity sat at 88%, heavy enough to bead on antenna housings and smear optics. Visibility was 6 nautical miles toward open water and barely 3 toward the Iranian shoreline, where coastal glow and dust haze flattened the horizon into a dull orange line. The missile missed the carrier by 200 meters. It did not hit steel. It did not need to. It detonated in a violent spray plume that rose higher than the island's superstructure, then collapsed back down in a sheet of black water that slapped the hull and turned the flight deck air into a stinging mist. The shockwave arrived a half-second later, felt like a punch through the ship's ribs, rattling lockers and making crew and passageways stop mid-step. For 11 heartbeats, the Gulf went eerily silent, the kind of silence that comes when 1,000 people hold their breath at once. Then the carrier strike group moved. I'm your host at US Defense Watch, where we break down the operations shaping global security. And what happened after an Iranian missile missed a US carrier by only 200 meters wasn't just another near-miss headline. It was a wake-up call for any fleet that thinks quiet means safe, and for any regime that believes it can fire warning shots without paying for the smoke. The aggressor was Iran. And the platform that shaped the night was not a single ship, but a layered threat package built around one missile shooter and multiple distractions. The trigger was a Mauj-class frigate positioned inside coastal clutter, running at 29 knots along a shallow arc 24 nautical miles north-northeast of the carrier's center. With Qatar anti-ship cruise missiles loaded and ready, the Qatar's range was 300 kilometers, far more than enough for this geometry, and its sea-skimming profile was designed to stay under radar horizons until the last possible minutes. Around the frigate, Iranian patrol boats moved like shards in the dark, 38 to 45 knots in quick surges, probing for a seam in the escort screen. And on shore, radar and electronic support sites held their breath, ready to light up if the Americans hesitated. The USS Abraham Lincoln did not hesitate. She was not alone. Her escort ring was tight and lethal. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers forward in the screen, one on the northeast quadrant and one on the northwest, both running with disciplined emissions and overlapping radar coverage. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser rode slightly aft, acting as the air defense brain with a combat information center built to coordinate multiple engagements simultaneously. Overhead, an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye held a wide orbit, feeding a composite picture through data links that made sure no single ship ever had to fight with only its own eyes. And in the dark water beneath the surface layer, an American attack submarine held a quiet patrol line, listening for anything that tried to exploit the chaos underwater. Iran's decision that morning was simple. They wanted a near miss, not a kill. A warning strike close enough to prove access, close enough to rattle nerves, close enough to force political caution. They believed the carrier strike group would respond with restraint. They believed the Gulf's clutter and the risk of escalation would protect them from immediate consequence. What they didn't know was that the US Navy had already been tracking the aggressor for 96 hours using surveillance assets. An MH-60R Seahawk lifted from the deck of the nearest destroyer, rotor wash shredding the haze into a swirling halo before the helicopter dropped low and accelerated toward the shooter's bearing. Its sensors were built for this exact environment. Multi-mode radar, infrared, and acoustic processing to track surface and subsurface threats. Under its stub wings, it carried weapons that turned boats into liabilities. And if the situation demanded, Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes ready to prosecute a submarine contact if Iran tried to complicate the night underwater. At 0451 hours and 26 seconds, the Seahawk's crew called the first confirmation. Visual IR on surface combatant. Weight consistent with medium frigate. Speed 29 knots, no compliance. The frigate was trying to run. Iran's commander now understood the near miss had not created hesitation. It had created permission. He ordered full speed and turned toward the Iranian coastline, believing coastal clutter and land-based coverage could shield him. He did not understand how quickly an American escort can turn distance into a trap. At 0452 hours and 03 seconds, the Northeast destroyer called out the supporting contacts. Fast contacts, multiple, bearing 021, range 20 nautical miles, speed 42 knots, likely patrol boats. The patrol boats were trying to do what swarms always do: create noise, split attention, force a misstep. They surged in staggered pairs, weaving between merchant traffic returns and coastal haze, hoping to draw one destroyer out of position. The destroyers did not break formation. At 0452 hours and 18 seconds, the carrier's defensive posture tightened. Phalanx CIWS mounts on the escort spun up, the 20mm barrels stabilizing and slewing, ready to engage anything that came inside the last line. RIM-116. Rolling airframe missile launchers indexed toward likely threat sectors, their seekers prepared to snap onto incoming sea skimmers. The point was not to fire. The point was to remove surprise. No one was going to let another missile come within 200 meters again. At 0452 hours and 49 seconds, the Seahawk issued a warning directly over maritime guard, amplified through loud hailer in the helicopter's own way, the kind of warning that sounds like it has already run out of patience. Iranian warship, this is U.S. Navy aircraft. Stop engines and prepare to be boarded. You are designated hostile. The frigate's response was not words, it was behavior. At 0453 hours, its radar emissions changed. Pulse patterns tightened. Beam dwell times increased. On American consoles, it appeared as a shift from navigation and search behavior toward targeting. The frigate was attempting a second shot. The U.S. commander saw the move and made a decision that ended the political fiction. A second missile would not be allowed to leave the rail. At 0453 hours and 19 seconds, the order went out: execute disable. The response unfolded in steps, each timed and layered. At 0453 hours and 27 seconds, the Seahawk moved to a standoff angle, lowering altitude to reduce radar exposure while maintaining sensor lock. At 0453 hours and 41 seconds, the Northeast destroyer brought its fire control solution to weapons quality. At 0453 hours and 56 seconds, the Northwest destroyer adjusted to keep a clean engagement lane in case the frigate launched anyway. At 0454 hours and 8 seconds, the first American strike hit the frigate's forward sensor cluster. It was not a random blast, it was aimed to blind. The frigate's radar face shattered. Secondary antennas snapped. Sparks and smoke rolled back across the bridge windows. The ship did not explode. It lost its eyes. Still, it ran. At 0454 hours and 29 seconds, a second strike landed amidships near the missile canister area. The deck erupted in a localized fireball and a cloud of gray smoke that slapped into the wind. The missile crews scattered. The canister area became a chaos of heat and flame. At 0454 hours and 48 seconds, the frigate's speed dropped from 29 knots to 17. At 0454 hours and 56 seconds to 11. At 0455 hours and 6 seconds to 6. By 0455 hours and 18 seconds, it was dead in the water, bow swinging with the chop as if the Gulf itself was deciding where the ship would point. Now the Iranian patrol boats faced an ugly choice. They could continue their rush and die in the engagement lanes. Or they could retreat and accept that the strike group had not only intercepted their political message, but crushed it. Two boats broke off immediately, turning hard north toward the coast at 44 knots. One tried to cut south behind a merchant hull, seeking cover. Another surged forward out of anger or desperation, closing the nearest destroyer in a straight line as if speed could erase physics. At 0455 hours and 41 seconds, the destroyer's warning came once, sharp and final. Iranian craft, turn away now. This is your last warning. No compliance. At 0455 hours and 52 seconds, a controlled burst cratered the water 90 meters ahead of the boat's bow, walking splashes like a ruler across its approach lane. The boat still did not turn. At 0456 hours and 07 seconds, the destroyer executed precision disablement. Rounds struck the boat's engine housing. The wake collapsed. Speed fell from 41 knots to 12 and 5 seconds. The boat yawed, corrected, then lost control, rolling in the chop like a wounded animal. The other Iranian boat saw the result and retreated. At 0456 hours and 22 seconds, the Gulf, which had been tense and black, began to light up. Not from sunrise, from retaliation. The U.S. commander did not stop with disabling the shooter. The near miss had come from a network. The network had to be punished, or it would be repeated. The strike group already had a list of supporting shore sites, coastal radar nodes, electronic support posts, command relays that had enabled the firing solution and coordinated the swarm. The point was not indiscriminate destruction. The point was removal of capability. At 0457 hours, Tomahawk launch cells opened aboard 2 escorts. The missiles left in disciplined sequence, not a single dramatic salvo, but a controlled ripple designed to arrive on multiple aim points inside a narrow time window. Each launch was a brief flash against the haze, a vertical plume that immediately tipped forward and vanished low over the sea. The Gulf lit up in pulses. At 0457 hours and 18 seconds, launch 1. At 0457 hours and 23 seconds, launch 2. At 0457 hours and 27 seconds, launch 3. At 0457 hours and 34 seconds, launch 4. Within 52 seconds, a second destroyer joined the sequence. More launches, more plumes. The air smelled of rocket exhaust for the first time. And on Iranian coastal sensors that were still alive, the realization arrived like ice. The Americans were not arguing about the near miss. They were cutting out the muscles that had made it possible. On shore, Iranian commanders scrambled. Search radars lit. Batteries tried to posture. Communications spiked in frantic bursts. But in a precision strike sequence, the goal is not to fight every defender. The goal is to hit the nodes that coordinate defenders. At 0459 hours, the first Tomahawk reached the Iranian coastline. The impact was not cinematic, it was surgical. An antenna farm folded, a generator house detonated. A command shelter's roof lifted and vanished in a wash of flame. The site went dark, not metaphorically but electronically. A second impact followed within 11 seconds at a separate location, then another. Then 2 nearly simultaneous strikes that collapsed a relay corridor. The Gulf glowed orange on the horizon. On the carrier, the watch teams did not celebrate. They counted, they verified. They watched for the other side's next move, because retaliation can trigger desperation. At 0500 hours and 11 seconds, an ESM console flagged a new coastal emitter attempting a targeting mode. The American escorts hardened their defense posture again. Phalanx remained spun. RAM remained indexed. The Seahawk stayed overhead, scanning for any last-ditch fast craft surge. At 0500 hours and 38 seconds, Iran tried anyway. A single coastal anti-ship missile launched toward the sea. A desperate act meant to prove that capability still existed. The launch plume was visible on infrared. The track was immediate on radar. The intercept sequence ran like a machine. At 0500 hours and 51 seconds, the missile was declared inbound. At 0501 hours and 3 seconds, an interceptor left a destroyer's launcher. At 0501 hours and 14 seconds, the intercept occurred 9.7 nautical miles from the formation. A flash, fragments, silence. The missile died before it could force close-in defenses to fire. Iran's remaining coastal commanders understood the new reality. The carrier strike group had been threatened. The carrier strike group had responded, and the response had not been a single angry shot. It had been layered dominance, defense, attribution, neutralization, and capability removal, all inside a tight timeline. 11 minutes after the near miss, the Gulf was lit by precision strikes and dying radar towers. On the Iranian frigate, now drifting, the emotional arc was complete. Pride at 0449. Shock at 0454, helplessness by 0455. The captain had believed he could send a message and live inside the gray zone. Instead, he had been blinded, disarmed, and reduced to a smoking hull watched by helicopters and destroyers that never once broke their calm. On the US side, the calm was not arrogance, it was training and architecture. A carrier strike group is not a single ship. It is a moving system designed to absorb a threat, identify the source, and respond without losing shape. The near miss had been dangerous, but it had also been useful. It confirmed Iran's intent. It provided track history, it exposed networks. It gave the US the justification to act decisively. The outcome was domination. The carrier remained unscathed. The shooter was neutralized. The swarm was broken. Supporting sites went dark. A follow-on missile was intercepted without drama, and the lesson is the one every modern navy must learn the hard way or the easy way. Misses by 200 meters is not misses by 200 meters is not de-escalation. It is an admission that you have crossed into the realm where the other side is allowed to remove your capability. Naval power in 2026 is not just about who has the biggest hulls. It is about who owns the timeline, who can see first, decide first, strike first, and still defend while striking. The side that can fuse satellite cues, P-8 tracking, airborne command and control, shipboard combat systems, helicopters, and layered interceptors into one coherent response does not simply survive near misses. It makes near misses the last mistake an aggressor ever gets to repeat. It started days earlier with satellite imagery flagging unusual activity at a coastal base, missile canister handling, power generator staging, and frigate preparations that did not match routine patrol patterns. A P-8 Poseidon had mapped the surface picture at standoff ranges, correlating electronic emissions with hull movement and building a behavior profile for the frigate's commander. The E-2D Hawkeye had maintained a rolling library of maritime tracks and watched for irregular speed changes. Undersea surveillance queuing and acoustic analysis had separated warship propulsion signatures from merchant noise. By the time the missile flew, the Americans weren't wondering who did it. They were confirming the final piece, intent. At 0449 hours and 18 seconds, the first radio call cut through the shock. Missile splash, port beam, estimate 200 meters, no hit, no fire. All stations, execute defensive posture. On the carrier's bridge and in her combat direction center, there was no shouting. There was only procedure snapping into place. The flight deck crew froze for a breath, then moved with purpose. The ship's defensive systems came alive like muscles flexing. The escort shifted from watch to war. At 0449 hours and 37 seconds, an Arleigh Burke destroyer on the northwest screen edge brought its Spy 1D radar to full tasking and pulled the missile's inbound track history from the fused picture. The track showed a low-altitude approach, a terminal adjustment, then a programmed miss. That detail mattered. This wasn't a stray shot, it was precision intimidation. At 0450 hours and 02 seconds, the Hawkeye's voice came across the secure net, calm as a metronome. Shooter assessed bearing 048, range 57 nautical miles from carrier. Surface combatant profile consistent with Mauj class. Additional small craft contacts north lane. 57 nautical miles. That meant the shooter was still inside an engagement box the US could close quickly. The American commander did not need to debate options. In a carrier group, the response to a missile shot is not negotiation, it is control. At 0450 hours and 19 seconds, the Ticonderoga cruiser issued the first formal demand, broadcast in clean maritime phrasing. Iranian warship on bearing 048, this is United States Navy. You have engaged a US naval vessel. Cease hostile actions immediately. Alter course to 090. Reduce speed to 5 knots. Acknowledge. There was no acknowledgement. On the Iranian frigate's bridge, the mood was a hard mix of pride and dread. The captain had executed his political task. Demonstrate access without crossing into open war. The missile had flown true. The splash plume had been seen. Now he expected the Americans to posture, to broadcast warnings, to move away, to argue on diplomatic channels. He expected delay. Instead, the delay belonged to him. At 0450 hours and 44 seconds, the American strike group commander shifted to the next phase. It was not called revenge. It was called neutralization. Designate shooter hostile. Maintain carrier defense. Prepare to remove launch capability. The words landed like a door locking. The escorts tightened geometry. The Northeast destroyer increased speed from 18 knots to 26, turning 3 degrees inward to close the north lane. The Northwest destroyer held 24 knots, adjusting to create an overlapping engagement arc. The cruiser slid a fraction farther aft to maintain command visibility while preserving a clean air defense sector. The carrier herself altered course 5 degrees to starboard and increased to 22 knots, not to run, but to keep the wind and sea state favorable for aircraft launch if needed. At 0451 hours, the air layer joined the fight.